to have this amazing big band in front of you, the Strauser Jazz Orchestra. And last concert we had for Ross's orchestra, I was blown away by his compositions. So I hope you enjoy tonight's performance.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. This has been such a cool day. Everyone showed up about 2 o'clock today to rehearse this music for the first time as this group. So that being said, there may be a few hiccups along the way, but we're going to give you guys the best show that we possibly can. A couple things I want to kind of get the talking out of the way first and then get into the program. First of all, I'd like to introduce the band. On vibraphones, we have Eric Zavala. On piano, Simon Lasky. On guitar, Drew Nicholson. On accordion, Per Danielson. On violin, Eliana Rupp. On bass, Marco Bohorquez. On drum set, Rod Elmore. On tenor sax as well, woodwind section, we have Jack Wilkins. Aaron West. Sammy Danielson. Alex Davidko. Pat Rubin. On bass trombone, that's Jordan Harris. Mick Pepper. James Wall. Philip Sokolowski. The trumpet section, we have James Stubbs. Jeff Woldridge. Jackson Hart. And Robert Carmichael. So, we're going to hear some great solos and music from all of these incredible musicians tonight. These are some of the best from the Tampa Bay area, so you're in for a real treat. I wanted to let you guys know that I have CDs available right outside here from my first record. So feel free to pick one of those up if you enjoy what you hear tonight. Kind of second order of business going off of that is that the music you're about to hear tonight is going to be professionally recorded about 1 month from now. So we're still working on kind of funding this project, and I would just encourage you to check out. I've set up a GoFundMe page, and you have this whole list of rewards. If you feel like you like what you hear, you can donate to that project to help us record our next album next month. Let's see what else. Just a little bit about what you're going to hear tonight. This is a suite of 15 movements that is about my journeys through Glacier National Park through my whole life. So what I did is I commissioned my younger sister, who's a great poet. So she wrote poems for every movement that you're going to hear. So I'm going to recite those before each of the movements, and I think without any further ado, we'll get started. So this is the introduction. Little sister and I roll up our jeans to our shins, slowly stepping into the water cooled by the runoff of winter, through the river into the lake, a red curtain forest, a theater by day. Nature pays perfect homage to the art we create, and art to nature just the same. few wishes our little car climbs. I wish I was on the little island in the middle of St. Mary. I wish I was atop heaven's peak to be one with the sky. I wish I was an alpine storm with sun peeking through the eye. But my final wish is to jump in the lake after such a lovely drive. to the wooden signs that Grandpa nailed to the bark of larches. I step out of the car, embraced all around by perfume trees. They smell the sweetest at the tail end of spring, and only reveal their magic when I stop to breathe by my cabin on the water, my home among the trees. The green boat smells of leather and vinyl. The green boat rocks in the waves. The green boat's old engine quits in the middle of the lake. Call Mike and the green boat is saved. The green boat drives past the Sanders house and picks them up. The green boat has a cooler full of that funny stuff. Only for the grown-ups cups. The green boat is too slow for me, but too fast for her. The green boat has never been perfect, but given there's good weather, I can live on her forever. slip down the mountainside, sinking into the lake, remaining upright. You can swim through the sky of the underwater forest. You can even touch your toes to the tops of the trees, where the wind once danced freely, where the eagle's nest used to be. A sixth sense disrupts the calm before the storm. In the midst of annual forest blaze, it seems that all we do is pray for rain. While the sky grays, white caps peak in the little lake waves, and back to the cabin we race. The boat gets tied and bundled up in its tarp, while we're bundled up inside, safe from harm. We watch out the windows as the boat dances around the buoy. We sleep the storm away and dream of the coming smokeless days, thanks to the rain. At least 5 fishing lures were lost to the rocks, and Dad had to cut my line. New hook and sinkers and 3 salmon eggs. The green boat was ready for a fish, but nothing ever came. I got my line tangled in seaweed, thinking somehow I got a bite. Dad and I would pull and laugh a little bit. He never really cared about the fish. So we decided to call it quits and just tell them we returned all the fish. But before we leave the water, Dad would ask me a favor. Can you dive down and find those lures for me later? In the arms of Orion, between the time the sun fully sets and the moon hasn't risen over Strawberry Mountain yet, you can see every bit of heaven, every little star. Never have I felt so small, yet so above it all. ride down the steep driveway always felt epic. Wild daisies brushing my legs, the lake light danced in our paths. Mark and Logan only came in the summer, but when they did, the house lit up like a jukebox. Inside, everything hummed, the jingling of Logan's bracelets, Mom's laugh that echoed off the wood-paneled walls, the low bass of Dad's voice telling Mark the past year of stories. With gin and tonics in every hand, I sipped mine slow, grinning a little too hard and pretending to belong, in a room full of glittering grown-ups who didn't seem to age. Nowadays, we all toast softer, but the magic's still there, floating in the sapphire, settling in our bones with laughter and light. We always take a bit too long to say goodnight. Dad pulled me on water skis behind the green boat, with mountains watching and the cousins cheering from the dock. I swear for a second I flew. The spray by my wake was a rainbow of stars for only a moment, and no matter how many times I fall, I can count on Dad to speed up again. Maya starts us off, red guitar in her lap. Singing folksy and soft, it opens the room like a window. We all lean in. Mike nods along, red wine staining his lips. He's been practicing a little piano all afternoon, but you never know it. It sounds as if he's remembering something he forgot to forget. The ghosts here are gentle, framed on the walls in black and white, and sitting with us quietly in the chairs that belonged to our great-grands. Outside, the lake glows like a memory. Inside, the sunken living room is full of our shoreline friends. We've all been coming here for years and know where the good seats are. She's finishing her song. Mike gives her a quiet nod, and now it's our turn. The saxophone is cool in my hands, and the air is warm with love. The first notes roll out, like a song has always been here. We fall into the tune, me and Mike. Our instruments speak with voices that have seen decades of summers and songs. We play until the light leaves the windows, and even then, Mom always says, one more, and of course we say yes. As you age, familiarity slowly gets stripped away, refined by passing time and eventually replaced. I now understand why Nana liked to sit in her worn, rocking patio chair, facing Lake McDonald's mountains. They were the only remaining things in her life that she could rely on never to die away or change. But they age too, at a much slower pace than we do. That one looks like a bear. That one's the chief. Over there is the garden wall, and Mount Brown looks like a lady, a beautiful lady laying down, with waterfall hair and an evergreen gown. She exhales stars over our tiny towns. She and the others are the land's protectors, sleeping giants who kiss the sky, the distant shapes to my human eye. air hangs heavy with the hush of gold. Sun filters through the spinning ashes. The arc of sun bows her head as the song of summer is nearing its end. The wildflower blossoms have come and gone. The grass fades in its color. The leaves change hue and slowly die, and their grief bellows red across the sky. A gentle wind stirs the trembling trees, carrying colors on the silent breeze. A beauty which lives must also fade, yet in its leaving, evening peace is made. The sky turns pink and I look up, just in time to catch the mountains blushing. My summer protectors, my sleeping giants, tucked into quilts of snow, cheeks dusted as if someone said something sweet in their eternal dreams. Goodbye mountains, growing smaller out of sight. I'll see you again when the time is right. Pass through the village and the cafe that we used to love, where we eat huckleberry pancakes and draw on the menus with the pens from Mom's bag. Take a left to Essex or a right back home. I feel my weight shift right as my eyes start to close. It's August and the sun is setting, creeping through my eyes. Goodbye, hungry horse, and all you strange little tones. The winding road with the weak radio signal tuned to Cool 105. We hear Dad's radio voice and laugh a little inside. Through the middle of the tea kettles, our little car drives, and back to reality in Whitefish, still glimmering with the day's last light. Dad just went down the back road, a sharp right turn. I see the silhouettes of sleepy cattle jumping over the moon. I see our house just out of reach. We unload the car before we can relax. Mom and Dad make a spread of leftovers, and it feels so good to be home. Thanks again, everyone, for coming out and supporting. Feel free to come hang out and talk to us. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it so much.